Hi, today we're talking with Professor Sumanth Gopinath. Sumanth is a music theory professor at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities in the School of Music. He has a bachelor's in electrical engineering from the University of Texas and a master's and a PhD in music from Yale University. How would you describe what you do in a way that someone listening to the interview could grasp what it's really like to be a professor of music theory?
So I have like a kind of general statement, and then maybe we can get into specific details. So, like most tenured academics in the humanities and qualitative social sciences, we typically do three kinds of things. We teach classes and advise students. That's the sort of teaching piece of what we do. We do research, which means we, you know, read and do some kind of work that ends up turning into, articles or publications or books of some kind. And then we also, in relation to that, we write grants as well. And that sort of depends on the project and the nature of the inquiry and opportunity involved. And then we do service, which includes university or collegiate service and then professional service. So, service at our employment institution and then service to our field. So, we can get into all of those things in some greater detail, but those are the basis of what we do, and it's written into my job contract that we do those things. In terms of what's one just doing with one's time, it's sort of like I said, it depends on the time of the year, from week to week, day to day. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that a lot of academics, especially those who don't do academic research based out of a research lab, that's the kind of big distinction that I think one has to make. Like, is one doing academic work that where you're kind of tied to this particular sort of like, you know, infrastructure and usually like a lab group and people that you're overseeing and working with, or are you more or less doing your research on your own? And I fall into the latter camp. In those kinds of jobs, which are a large number of, I wouldn't know if the proportion, I couldn't tell you that, but certainly a large number of academic jobs are like that. You often have a great deal of control over your own time, which is the beauty of it. Um, but it also means that, again, day to day, things look very different. Um, if you're teaching, a class, then on a teaching day, you have to obviously show up and be at the office and teach that class. But usually, teaching a class takes hours and hours of preparation beforehand. If I'm teaching, say, a graduate seminar, which meets, most classes are 3 hours a week of teaching, and it's pretty standard that for R1 or like high level research institutions, um, it's a designation that's given to them. You typically teach like two classes a semester in my field. In other fields, it can be less, sometimes more, but um, other institutions actually do often have higher teaching loads. They can even have three courses a semester or sometimes even four. But typically, like two is a sort of baseline for many institutions. So, say I'm teaching a graduate seminar, which is a sort of high level class. I will have assigned, say, a book a week, maybe plus other things, plus other tasks, and so I'm preparing and reading that book or set of essays or whatever, doing like 14, 15, maybe 20 hours of prep a week just doing that for that one class. And then we meet for 3 hours. All sorts of things that one can do to kind of like create an object of analysis. And that's the kind of thing that music theorists, at least one facet of what we do, would be typically to take some aspect of music and turn it into an object of kind of critical analysis to do different things with it. One, to understand how it works. Like, how did the person do this thing? Or how do we understand it from like a general sort of sense, like why do this thing and then something else after it? That's a good question, right? Like if someone wants to write music or someone wants to think about how music is written, you know, there are infinite choices one can do, right? You can choose to play one chord, you choose to play another chord. You can choose to sing this lyric or choose to sing that lyric. You can sing this melody or that melody. You can play this instrument or that, right? So like there are all these decisions that go into making any piece of music. And often we don't talk about those decisions, people just do it. But music theorists sort of will often take those decisions as not just a thing you take for granted, but that become questions to understand how it works. So that's a big thing, how to understand how it works. I think academics, in part, at least in our general orbit of fields like humanities, social sciences, like study of the arts, often our job is to kind of question. Like we're taking things that are often taken for granted, and to say, how do you rethink what this is? How do you understand it better? How do we reframe it based on some other perspective that we hadn't considered before? Right now, a lot of the academy is really thinking a lot about race and racism. How does that shape, what we thought we knew about something, and then we totally rethink it because we now are taking a new factor into consideration that we hadn't before. Music theory exists in a landscape of very different kinds of fields in academic music studies. I think this was inspired by, you had a comment earlier when we were communicating, or in your show notes, about there being like what does it mean to be a professor of music, and they can mean a lot of different things. So I just wanted to kind of list some of those things, because music theory exists alongside a bunch of other different academic music professions. So there's musicology, which is typically the history of Western music. That's changing, but a lot of it has focused on Western classical music and increasingly on Western classical and popular music, so jazz, pop, rock, hip hop, whatever. There's ethnomusicology, which is historically been the study of non-Western music, but is more broadly conceived of as the anthropology of music. So people are doing anthropological field work on sites, meeting people, interviewing them, participating in their activities, getting to know a musical practice that way, which, and their research areas are all over the world. Those scholars also can often teach performance in one or more non-Western traditions. Like they might run an ensemble dedicated to, say, Indonesian music, gamelan. That would be a very traditional one that people do in ethnomusicology. There's music education, which is like sort of research on and teaching the credentialing necessary for public school and, or I should say, primary and secondary school music teachers, K through 12. There's music therapy, which is the study and practice of the use of music in clinical, medical, and psychological contexts. There's composition, which involves creating and then teaching the creation of new musical compositions. This can extend to non-notated improvisational music making. A lot of people who are typically in schools of music are part of what sometimes gets called applied music. They're the people who teach instrumental or vocal performance or conducting. This is often historically within the orbit of Western classical music, but that's changing too. And then there are certain kind of areas that get sometimes their own designation, like jazz studies, which blends a lot of these different things, can sometimes get its own kind of marker, and people will do different things. Sometimes you'll have someone who's teaching performance, arranging, composition theory all together, like in different courses. But so different areas sometimes divide things up differently based on the type of music involved. But those are the typical things that happen in schools and departments of music.
Do you have a way you could break down? During this season, I'm usually, you kind of got into the how much time you're planning in the classroom. Outside of that, are there other seasons or big gaps that are significant gaps where you're not part of that routine, but it turns, you have other routines that start up at different phases, and then those kind of, they delineate from each other where they have boundaries at different times of the year? Maybe it would probably sound like be an easier way to break your routines up, around the
Yes,
semesters. Or
definitely.
okay.
Definitely. So, like during the school year when you're teaching, then teaching tends to take up everyone's time. If you're teaching 2 classes a semester, I often will have like a graduate seminar and then like an undergraduate course. An undergraduate course, I'm doing lectures, and I might be teaching like the very basics of like how to understand, you know, the I don't know, like like that score I showed, like the how do you analyze the modes in this particular score, and so I would give people a kind of like, there are labels for these things, and people would have to learn how to do it, and some aspect of it is really basic, and then the more detailed you get, the more interesting it gets. So they range in terms of the like level of depth that we're dealing with. But during the semester, yeah, the teaching takes up most of the time. I mean, I would say, you're doing it 40 hours a week. I mean, it's supposed to be only 20 hours a week in our contracts or whatever, but it's like a full-time thing. But then on top of that, I also have, PhD and master's students. So I'm advising them, meeting with them. And when they're like getting something done, then all of a sudden the workload of that sort of takes over, and I have to read their work, and then we discuss it. And it's most important when they're getting to major like deadlines. Are they submitting their dissertation for defense, or are they before then, are they doing a qualifying exam, and we have to like sort of test them on their basic competence in the field, that sort of stuff. So it really depends on, um, the sort of life cycle in the student's progress in their degree program. But I would say those things, since they typically teach as well, they tend to kind of squeeze that stuff in to, towards the end of terms or in between the terms. So that would be another kind of rhythm. Like I have a dissertation that I have to read, that the defense in which is on the 30th. And so that's classes are long over, but that's a typical time when some of these things will happen. So yeah, in addition, during the semester, we typically tend to have a lot of most of our administrative meetings. I guess the other key things besides teaching and service would be research. And that's a whole other kind of thing, because typically it's self driven. You have to just get things done and get them out in print, or, you're giving talks at conferences, or, there's some other ways to kind of like get affirmation for your work, like writing grants or grant applications. That again depends on the nature of the work, and the timeline for those things is very different. I mean, I think you just kind of, you have, on the one hand, when you don't have tenure, you have a clock, and you have to get a certain amount of stuff in print or ready to be in print by the time you go up for tenure. I did that, now like 11, 12 years ago. And at that time, I had written a number of articles and had a book manuscript, and had just gotten the kind of positive reviews for it, and had a contract, and all that stuff was sort of like in the process um, as I went up for tenure. And so the tenure clock, which it varies, but at our institution, it was like 6 years, and I had a year that or a semester that it took off without pay for various reasons, and that extended my clock. So it made it a 7-year process. And at the end of it, um, I had all this stuff I'd done, and then I went up for tenure. So that creates this kind of like pressure. And the tenure process is usually kind of creation of this body of work that you then build on for the rest of your career. Um, so yeah, so the after you have tenure, there are sort of subsequent reviews in terms of like, are you meeting your expectations in terms of the scale of your publishing and your work? And most of us usually are. And so then the only other question is, when you're at my level, which is associate professor, there's one more level above me, which is a full professor. And so I need to publish one more book, like a solo authored book typically, in order to then advance to full professor. So I've published articles. I'm working on a book project now. I've got other things I've done, like edited books, where I wasn't the sole author, but I kind of collected the authors together and I wrote part of it. So I have like a total of 3 books, one of which is like a 2-volume book. So um, one of which is a book I wrote on the cell phone ringtone industry, and its sort of the relationship between its economic structure and technical file formats, and then the way that those related to um, different cultural uses of the ringtone, more or less. And that book was the tenure book that I wrote to get tenure. And then I also edited something called the Oxford Handbook of Mobile Music Studies, which is related to that kind of stuff, sort of digital and cell phone based, mobile culture issues in relation to music and sound. And then I 4 years ago a book came out called Rethinking Reich, which is on the music of a U.S. American composer, Steve Reich, who I wrote my dissertation on. And that book is another edited volume, and it's sort of one of the major research reference points on his music.
That sounds like a lot, to be honest, like all the different things.
It
So
is a lot.
it leads me to, two ways to ask this question. One is, is all of this happening between 9 to 5, like on campus, and then you go off and, unplug and go live another life outside of work, and then what's your work life balance? My perception is this is your life. It's like you kind of, it's your lifestyle. It's not like your work. Some people have a job, they have a lifestyle. Like, I don't know, maybe because I know you a little bit too, but it sounds like what I'm hearing is this is your work is your lifestyle. Your lifestyle is your work, kind of. Correct me if I'm wrong, but uh, I'm not getting the sense that you just go work 8 to 5 and then you go become another person when you go home in the evenings. But how is that work life balance, kind of with professorship in general? But then maybe, would you say that's a general uh, way of being for professorship, not just music theory in this case, but like a tenured professor? Is that pretty common? That work life balance? Maybe if you could elaborate on what that's like a little bit.
Sure. Yeah, it's difficult. It is a kind of job that you're always doing and thinking about. I may be reading about something, even if I'm not reading, I'm thinking about it. So it is something that's kind of, you know, it is always with you. You're always thinking about and worrying about and thinking about the next thing you have to do. You're always behind because there are so many things that you have on your plate that that are expected of you. So it is constant in some way. I mean, I do make a certain timeout for you know like two main things I would say. I mean, I have a partner and we try to kind of like, she's also an academic, and we try to kind of just block out a certain amount of time for ourselves, like where we'll sit and cook and or eat together and like maybe watch a television show or something. So I try to do some of that every day or most days. But beyond that, I mean, and then the second thing that we do, and she's also a musician, so we do a lot of music together and we perform, and that is something that is related to my job. It's informed by it, and it informs my teaching and informs my research, but it isn't directly related to the job. Like, I'm not hired to do that work the way some musicians are hired to be creative performers and writers and whatever. But that's not my appointment, and so that is something that I've chosen to just dedicate a lot of time to, even though it's not associated with my job. And I sort of treat it as, in some ways, as related to my research. And it does inform my research. I mean, I'll often be thinking about songs or artists, and then I'll be performing or playing music that's informed by, or sometimes covering or whatever. Like, so they do intersect, and it gets back into that point you said about this being it is my life and it is my lifestyle. And so I see those things as very related. And we'll put stuff like, our band released our fifth album this year, and I put that stuff into my activity report every year, even though I know it doesn't carry the same weight or meaning as when I publish an article or a book or whatever. But it is meaningful, and people take note of it. So that what I would say. Those are the two main things I do to try to have a kind of life out of myself. And I try to exercise and be as healthy as possible, as much as I can. I mean, you have to, but it is demanding though. I mean, it means like a lot of evenings you're just working, you're just reading and thinking and keeping up with stuff. And especially during the school year, um, there's just a lot to keep up with.
Yeah, so somebody that's getting it, thinking they may want to pursue this career, into academia like that, like, I guess that's something I would think they would want to know ahead of time, that they're gonna just gonna have that feeling of, um, I'm never done. I'm always behind, and that can be taxing mentally for some people who like closure on things. They like to finish something, tie it off, move to something else. Like, that is a different mindset, that you just go your whole life knowing but you're okay with that. Like, that it is it's something to be aware of, because I think that could burn some people out who aren't prepared. If they don't know that ahead of time going in, and they find out after they've been there a few years, and then they've went down that road and said, "Man, I wish I would have knew this before." Just how that's going to affect me. So I'm glad you brought that up. Of that's there. It's manageable, like you said, but you have to a be conscious and be aware of it, and b do things to help manage it so that you do feel some level of control of your life. You've mentioned a few times about like your assisting, or I forget what the phrase you used for describing what you're doing. A visiting professor at UT. You went to seminars. Do you travel a lot in your role? Is that just you specifically, or would anybody in your role be expected to kind of do things like that?
I think it depends. I think, yeah. I mean, the more research you do, like for your job, the more likely you will to be to travel more. But there are people who just do research based on the work and information they can get from their own libraries. And music theory is a field like that. There are people often historically there were just people who got scores, maybe recordings, and just analyzed and read and listened and thought and wrote about them. And so you don't have to do travel for that, but then you would often travel when you're giving presentations on that work. Um, I would say I travel a fair amount compared to some of my colleagues. I get invited to give talks a fair bit, or be involved in conferences in other ways. And then, yeah, this semester, I mean, this is the first time I've ever done a visiting position like this. So this is new for me. But this past semester, I was away, most of the first half of the year because it was at a different institution far away from Minnesota. So, but yeah, largely I would say so that's a special case and not typical for me. But largely, I would say I travel. I don't know. I might travel 4 times a semester, to give talks or do other things. Maybe
Okay.
something like
I
that.
thought you were going to say
Yeah.
4 times a year. I was going to say that's probably not too much, but then you ended it with semester. That's, yeah.
Yeah.
For
No, I
me, I would
travel a
consider
fair
that a lot
bit.
of
Yeah.
travel. Yeah.
Yeah. It's a
Okay.
significant amount.
Yeah. Nope. Good to know. That's on the topic of income. Like I'll leave this up to you how you would like to discuss it. On a general sense, or my my question would come from just that not looking at academia, but looking at the world of humanities, or um, music related things versus like engineering degrees or doctorate degrees. But how does that play out in academia? Do you find that it really doesn't matter? That's your topic of study in academia doesn't matter on a scale, versus like experience and your level of professorship that you attain. That does that tend to dominate kind of the financial discussion? Um, or is it topic based, or and I'm sure cost of living in different areas of this country, or the size of the school probably plays some factor too. But do you have any feedback, or you'd like to share on that topic?
Sure, I'm happy to talk openly about it. I mean, our salaries are public knowledge, so uh, people can look them up and find them out. I make just under $90,000 a year, so I don't make a ton of money, but I'm, you know, not poor either. I would say that that for my job, and I will likely get some kind of merit raise this year, so that I think I'll be up solidly above 90. But that's I would say that there are multiple factors. One, a couple of which you mentioned. One is just the experience, like how many years you've been in it, so that therefore, um, your salary accumulates based on experience. If you're getting raises, some institutions don't pay regular raises, and that's an issue. I mean, academics generally are kind of underpaid. Um, the second is uh, what you talked about in terms of the specific geography where you are. So, like, based on where you live, cost of living does affect salaries. So, in a less expensive city, you'll typically have a lower salary. But the third is very field specific. And, there is absolutely a kind of stratification of incomes based on the field you're in. The people who tend to get paid the best are economists. Um, they they're paid very handsomely for their work. They also can moonlight at institutions like the Fed and can make as much as $500,000 a year for a tenured economist. Um, For people in the arts and humanities, we're on the lower end of the spectrum, for tenured faculty, I should say. So I'm like, on the lower to middle end of what my colleagues make who do what I do. Not at the absolute bottom, but I'm in the middle to middle, maybe slightly lower end. Um, but then beyond me, there are faculty who don't have tenure, and they are paid significantly lower than I'm paid. If you have a stable lectureship job, you might get 50 or 60K. If you're piecing a life together by teaching course by course, uh, what are called adjuncts, I mean, you might be making 20 or 30K, So, our university pays, there's no standard rate, but uh, in many cases it's like $6,000 per 3 credit class. That's and no benefits. So if you teach 4 classes, a year, that's $24,000. That's not very much. Um, People would often try to teach more than that in those contexts, 3 or 4 classes a semester. Maybe that'll push you up to in the 30s or 40s. But that's low. That's a very low rate in today's economy. One of the reasons that, and one of the things I put a lot of my time into, in addition to all the other stuff I'm doing, is that I'm very active as a kind of advocate politically for faculty who are not tenured. I am, among the many hats I wear, one of them is I'm the campus chapter president of the American Association of University Professors, or AAUP. This is the organization that was founded in 1915 and theorized and then advocated politically for tenure and its tie to academic freedom. So I spent a lot of time on this work. Like, we're often writing editorials, or we're talking to our colleagues, or we're doing research, or holding meetings, or like sometimes talking to legislators about how things work at the university, particularly for non-tenure stream faculty, and what we can do about it. Sometimes this gets into unionization efforts and campaigns, either supporting them or being involved in them ourselves. I mean, we haven't had a successful one, but some faculty across the country are unionized. So that's another dimension of the stuff that I've spent a lot of time thinking about and being involved in. And it's precisely because of these salary and benefit issues. And it's personal. I mean, my partner is one of those faculty. She doesn't get paid that well, and so she's had a rough go of it. But it's something I've cared about pretty strongly since graduate school, when I first learned about this facet of academia. But sometimes this flows into my academic writing, so I have published articles that touch on these issues too. I have given talks on these things. So it's, again, all kind of part of the way that I've constructed what I think of as my career. So that's more or less the salary stuff for me. I would say, in addition, because I have this other stuff I do, like giving talks, um, being an external reader for some projects, those things can pay. So I make a little extra money that way. My music makes a little extra money too, although largely I use it to pay my band. Um, but um, but I do make a little money at that stuff too. It's None of it adds up to a total of $10,000 a year, but maybe it's you know some thousands of dollars, which is not nothing.
You've actually touched on a few things in there that would have, was going to bring up later about the different. There's your job role, tenured assistant professor, and then you've mentioned, if you could just kind of break, you had the adjunct, non-tenured, then you had the tenured, then the assistant professor, professor. What would be those levels? And this not dealing with income, just what would be those different levels somebody could kind of connect in a job role with professorship, I guess, if that's the right word to use.
Sure. So it would start maybe with teaching assistants, who are typically graduate students, and they're students and teachers at the same time. There are also teaching assistants across the country who have unionized. In fact, the teaching assistants at the University of Minnesota just unionized, so that's been a big thing, that now the university's figuring out what to do about, or how to. And they've said that we'll negotiate with them, so it's just a matter of figuring out the details. After that, there are adjuncts who teach at a course by course basis. They are paid the least well, as I said. Then there are more stable lecturers or other non tenure stream faculty. They, unlike adjuncts who typically have to like hustle for courses semester by semester or sometimes year by year. They typically have renewable or renewed contracts, and there are, even within that, there's a wide range of stability that exists. And then there are the tenure stream professors, and the three categories are assistant professor, which is typically someone who is on the tenure track but doesn't have tenure. There's associate professor, which is me, which is you've gotten tenure. And then there's full professor, and it's just professor. And that would be that you've gone through yet another professional advancement process to get to full professor, which is what I'm sort of working on. Beyond that, there are administrative roles, and those roles vary a lot. They can be directors of you can be head of a specific committee. In addition to just being on committees, you can be the chair of a committee. That entails more work, and sometimes pay. There are positions like the two sort of main positions within a department or unit are the director of undergraduate studies and the director of graduate studies. They tend to like sort of oversee all the programs and are the kind of main reference point for addressing the needs of however many students there are in graduate and undergraduate programs, respectively. And then there's the chair or director, the head of the unit, and they have to oversee everything, including all the budget, whatever development or fundraising they can do. That sort of depends on the institution and context. And then beyond that, beyond a chair or director is then when you become a dean, and the deans are usually like administrative roles in like a larger structure, like a college or entire university. And those roles, you should also pay better. Sometimes you still teach when you're doing those roles, but sometimes you stop teaching. Those roles can be temporary, but then some people also kind of go into academic administration as a career. And that's one of the big trends that we've seen in the last few decades, that increasingly this kind of move into administration, and that there's a kind of administrative class of academics who are paid significantly better than faculty, and that they tend to move around a lot. They're like at a place for like 5 years or 3 years, and they go somewhere else. And there are concerns about the fact of like that there's a kind of separate administrative class out there. So in the past, faculty just did the roles and they didn't get paid much better for them. So anyway, those are the kind of ranks of things. You can also have positions that aren't those things. Like there are sometimes postdoctoral positions. That's more common in the sciences, but increasingly in the humanities, and social sciences, you'll have those kinds of jobs where you might have a small teaching load, or maybe not even any teaching, and you're just mainly doing research for a year, but attending talks and being a member of the academic community. There are, especially in the sciences, like staff researchers who, they would work in particular roles in relation to whatever research project or entity they're part of. Like there are, you know, probably other sorts of para academic roles I don't know a ton about, but there are consulting firms that might be involved in hiring. I've certainly encountered some of those, and others that connect or intersect with academia but aren't formally part of the role. And finally, one of the things that's, I think, one of the most disturbing, although people have different opinions about it, aspects of academia is that there are positions that are essentially unfunded positions where you get a position, you get an office and maybe like lab space, but you essentially have to keep applying for grants to pay for your own salary. And that's again more typical of the sciences.
Music theory. If someone was getting started in it, like, are there specific? Trying to think of a way to word this, but like top-notch programs, or if you're going to go to school for something to kind of move into this direction, would you have any recommendations? Like, well, if you're going to do this and you want the best chances at you know surviving it and excelling at it, you should check out these top three places. Or is it pretty widespread and anybody can get involved in it, and then it just becomes what they make out of it for themselves?
This is a great question, something that I struggle with, because the answer is sort of yes to all of it to some extent. So historically, the PhD programs that are famous started in the like 60s and 70s. Music theory as a professional discipline is new. Usually it's an identity or an activity that went along with other things that people did. And typically the people who did music theory were composers. Composers also wrote treatises and texts on music theory, for part for pedagogical reasons, and part because they were doing speculative inquiries into things as part of their broader intellectual activity. So this professional music theory category is new and sort of specific to North America. A lot of what we do in other countries and other places is just subsumed under the idea of the kind of research on music or musicology. So anyway, that's one strange thing about where we are here. But anyway, yes, there are. So the two most famous programs are historically were at Yale University and the Eastman School of Music. I went to Yale. I have all the benefits from having gone to school like that. In addition, other like sort of elite private universities, Ivy League schools have strong music theory programs. Columbia University, Harvard University, the University of Chicago. There are others, but those are kind of the primary ones historically. But there also are a lot of state schools that have very strong music theory programs as well. University of Michigan, Indiana University. Those are probably two of the sort of biggest ones. But also UT Austin has a strong music theory program. Ohio State University, University of Minnesota, and there are others. And so one of the things that Temple University has started a PhD program is getting some placements. So there are more, and even besides those, there are other schools that have, that might have less of a sort of big theory profile, but still do place, like uh, Penn, which is another Ivy League school, has had a small but prestigious music theory program, um, especially in the past, although it still is still prestigious now. And I would say to give advice to someone who's kind of entering this landscape, it is complicated. Um, think really hard about what you want to do. Um, it's increasingly important to have a good idea of your research agenda and stuff that you really care about, and to hang on to that, because that's going to help you get through all the difficulties of any graduate program. They're always difficult. Um, and and then to like think about advisors, like who do you want to work with, and especially finding a program that maybe has a few people you would like to work with, not just one. um, but I also encourage people to go where they offer you money, because being graduate school is poor. You're it's hard and it's difficult, and so programs that have more resources, they benefit you. And yeah, that's something that I think is a really important factor to consider. Um, so yeah, it's a complicated decision to make. I also used to, I mean, when I was on the job market, I did ask about their placement rates, like what percentage of their students are getting into tenure track jobs.
If someone was starting to look at jobs, what would you advise there? What's some specific? I guess one thing I always ask is, are job postings listed on specific organization or websites, or are they generic where you just go to Indeed and LinkedIn and look for your job role, or is it a little more segmented places or specialized places to look, or how would one approach that?
Yeah, this is a good question. I'm putting a link in the chat so you can share that if people are interested. It's a job wiki for music theory and composition in academia, and it's pretty much become the standard go-to place for most job announcements. There are other institutions. It's not probably not the most comprehensive, but it's pretty close. The College Music Society is another music academic organization that has job listings, and that people in the job market historically used to then be sure to subscribe and get access to that information. But a lot of it is going on this wiki now, and so that's been something that's changed that whole process. Sometimes just jobs will appear at individual schools, and they're not necessarily well announced for whatever reason. Um, if you're a member of the Society for Music Theory, the professional society that's sort of is sort of like helps shape our field and provide opportunities for presenting your research at conferences, etc. They also have an announcement list, and they often put job announcements there. There are also job announcements on their Facebook page and stuff. So there's a few different places to go. The academic jobs wiki is a good starting place. And then you asked a couple things. One was if there was something I would do different, and what would I tell the future me. I guess I feel like my career has worked out well. I feel really lucky. I like all the things more or less that I'm doing. I feel like I made the decisions that I feel good about when presented with opportunities that I had. So I don't feel like I necessarily want to change anything I did, but I think my model was not necessarily always the wisest one. I certainly wish I had had greater training in music. I mean, I think the fact that I have this engineering background has been good for my work, and so I really value and encourage interdisciplinarity. But I do wish that I'd had a richer training in more types of music. But the second thing was that I wrote a book for my tenure project that wasn't my dissertation book. It was a new project. It came out of a project. This is the ringtones project I was describing earlier. It came out of a project I did in high school alongside my dissertation. It's not the dissertation, but that ended up being risky because it took a long. It was a. I mean, it took almost a decade to write that project and get it into print, but from when it started, but it wasn't the dissertation, and it's a big book, and it was ambitious. I It was really hard to do. I don't think I'll ever write a book like that again. I mean, I wish I could, but I don't think I have it in me. But that I would say that the smarter way would be to kind of develop your dissertation into your book. That's I think the most sensible way to do it. And I don't know if I would have done that because I was fearful about the subject of my dissertation, who is a composer who's complicated and still living. And so I've published articles from my dissertation. At some point, I may go back and like actually pull that all together into a book. I'm not sure, but yeah. So that was one thing I think I did that I maybe. I mean, I'm glad I did it the way I did it, but it was a kind of consideration that I would certainly maybe wanted to have thought through a little more carefully. In terms of telling a future me something, the thing that I'd really want to tell them is just, well, there are two things. I mean, I would say the big thing is trust your instincts. Um, if you feel passionately about something, and especially if others are dissuading you from doing it, you should listen to them. I don't think you should ever just be pigheaded and not listen to what anyone says. But you should not discount your impulses. I would say at the time I was coming up in the field, I wanted to do things that were different from what my mentors had done. And music theory was generally a pretty rigid field. Um, Nowadays it's actually quite wide open, and people are coming in doing kind of whatever they want, and that's great. um, but it does mean you have to hone your instincts, like what are you really passionate about doing, and like hang on to that. That's really really important. um, so I would say that's an important thing. It's also, of course, good to learn from your teachers, explore what they're doing, pay attention to what they're saying. I think any good teacher is going to tell you something that will stick with you in your life, and you'll come back to it. I mean, I have many moments like that with a lot of my best teachers, and so certainly listening to your getting good advice um, and counsel is important. And maybe the other thing I would say is don't do this alone. Like build a network of people who are doing it with you. This includes, your class. If there are an incoming class of students who are in music theory with you, but also in the field more broadly. If you're in a program that's small, get to know people outside your program. Um, get to know people outside your field so that you can bounce ideas off them in a different way, even if what you're doing is relatively specialized. They're going to have things that can help you rethink what you're doing, help you explain it to someone who isn't an expert. Getting that skill is really important. And then having a network of people to support you, like family, friends, loved ones, partners, like those sorts of social supports are important because it's challenging and I think hard to do this alone. So for me, anyway, having a network there was absolutely essential.
I hope people take that and actually. It's not the first time I've heard that. That trust your instinct, your passion, um, and at the same time networking. You're not alone. Those that tends to bubble to the top a lot, and when the voice of experiences, they're speaking back to the next person. So I'm glad to hear that's coming through uh, pretty frequently, in a good way. And my hope is somebody trying to, will hear that, I guess, when they need to hear it. They're going to get through this and listen to it, or they're going to be wondering if this is the right thing for them. They're going to be doubting themselves, even though they feel passionate about it. Honestly, I felt that way about this project I'm doing. It's not my thing. I'm getting out of my comfort zone, but it's, if, there's a, so it's even speaking to me a little bit, that, like, I go back and forth on, do I have the energy for this? But then it's like I feel so strongly about it that, but then it's getting out and doing that passion and trusting your instincts to just go, just go and trust your instincts that they're going to lead you somewhere good. So hopefully this finds, someone at the right time too, where they get that, this gives them a, extra push they need to keep on going on. So, well, thank you for your time.
Yeah, thanks
And
for having me.